Guten Morgen, guten Tag, guten Abend. So today we have chapter 17, Kapitel 17.1, double infinitives. I call these piles of verbs. It's some of the most complex stuff you can do with verbs in German. So we've come a long way with verbs, and hopefully we can start to pick out what happens when you have many verbs piled up at the end of a sentence. So let's go back to our present tense of modal so that we can get to the perfect tense of modal verbs. So modal verbs were dürfen, können, mögen, müssen, sollen, and wollen. So to be allowed to be able to, mögen is just to like, müssen to have to, must, sollen to be supposed to, should, wollen to want to. So these are called modal verbs because they express the attitude toward the main verb or the mode of the main verb, right? I want to do something is different than I have to do something. That's the attitude or the mode. So they generally occur with a dependent infinitive, as in, that just means the infinitive at the end of the sentence when you have a modal verb. So, die Studenten müssen viele neue Formen lernen. So the students must learn many new forms. Müssen is the modal verb. The students have to, or the students must. And then learn, to learn is at the end of the sentence. And so these two verbs come together to make the verb form, which is just modal verb plus dependent infinitive, or just the other infinitive, right? So this is present tense. When we did modal verbs, we did them in the present tense. And it's really easy to put this into the past tense by saying, by using the simple past of müssen there, which we learned as well. So it's just musste, or in this case, since it's plural, mussten. So it'd be die Studenten mussten with a T, no umlaut, and then T-E-N at the end. That would be the simple past. But you can also do a sentence with a modal verb in the other past tense that we learned, the perfect tense. And the thing about the perfect is that it's already sort of a compound verb situation going on, so it's going to be a little more complicated to put it together, but we'll look at that. And then also in the future, you can use a modal verb as well. That would be like, I will have to do this. So whenever you use the perfect tense, which is the past tense with either sein or haben plus the past participle, you remember the past tense where you actually use the past participle instead, that one, perfect. Or the future, when you use a modal in either of those two verb tenses, you end up with two infinitives at the end of the sentence called the double infinitive. So double infinitive is just one infinitive after the other, two of those, and then in the normal verb position, the second verb in the second position, so in the standard position you would normally have the verb in the case of the perfect, you're going to actually have your helping verb, which is haben. And in the case of the future, you're going to have your helping verb, which is werden. So because we've added in these other helping verbs, what ends up happening is that the modal verb goes to the very end. Normally, in the present tense, the modal verb would be here in the second position, like this one. Die Studenten müssen, second position verb. But now we have haben in the second position, so müssen has been kicked all the way to the end of the sentence, and then lernen was at the end, and then it's still like at the end, except for müssen is way at the end now, so then it ends up being second to last. So die Studenten haben viele neue Formen lernen müssen. The students had to learn many forms. So the thing is, normally in the perfect you would expect a version of haben, like a conjugated haben, and then you would expect a past participle at the end. Like it would be, if the students learned many new forms, it would be die Studenten haben viele neue Formen gelernt. You would expect past participle gelernt there. But we don't have a past participle at all. What happens, the modal verb just makes it happen differently, right? So instead of making a past participle, there's no past participle, and there's a double infinitive instead. And so it's kind of hard to recognize as a past tense because there's no past participle that you would expect, right? It just looks like haben could be present tense. The students have. It looks like present. And then the only reason that in the perfect it starts to look like past is because you got the past participle in, have learned, right? But here we just have a haben, which is being used as a helping verb here, and then two infinitives, and infinitives don't really imply the past tense. So that's why it's important to be able to recognize this structure, because it doesn't intuitively look like a past tense form. So you just have to memorize that haben plus double infinitive, and one of them being a modal verb at the end, means actually the perfect, the conversational past tense. Yeah. And then, die Studenten werden noch mehr neue Formen lernen müssen. So now we have werden, meaning the future, will. The students will have to learn even more new forms. Noch mehr, even more new forms. So it's the same structure where werden is a helping verb for the future, and then we have the same double infinitive thing happening at the end. Yeah. So let's look at some more. Pay close attention. The conjugated verb in the perfect tense is haben, and in the future tense is werden. The finite verb, as in the conjugated verb, is werden. So here, in this last one, it was haben and werden because it's plural, the students. So you want to say they have, they will. It's just conjugated for they. So haben, sie haben, sie werden. Let's look at some with just singular. Er hat, so he has. It has to be conjugated for that subject. So er hat viel lernen müssen, which is he had to learn a lot. So er hat is conjugated in the present tense, and then we got the double infinitive. So the present perfect, which means actually the past. He had to learn a lot. But if you don't know that that's the structure, you might end up with something like he has a lot to have to learn or something, right? He has a lot to have to learn. It's kind of what it looks like, but that's not it at all. It's past tense. He had to learn a lot. Yeah. The hat and the müssen kind of go together. The hat plus müssen make that past tense, but it's hard because müssen is in the infinitive, not in the past participle, which you would normally need to make the perfect. Ich werde auch viel lernen müssen. I will also have to learn a lot. So I will also have to learn a lot. So in the future, you've got your conjugated werden, and then you just have the main verb as an infinitive, second to last, and then the modal verb as an infinitive at the very end. So here we have hat viel lernen müssen. This is the same sentence. Hat viel lernen müssen. Hat viel lernen müssen. So he had to study a lot. It's the past tense of must, so he had to. He had to study a lot. So the perfect with a modal verb is actually quite rare. What we're doing here is like the other form, the alternate form. The standard form that people use is actually musste viel lernen. So hat viel lernen müssen. You will encounter it sometimes. It's definitely out there, and you might encounter it, and you might have to translate it at some point, right? But the more common form is actually with the simple past with the modal verb, as opposed to the perfect with a modal verb. Because look at how much easier it is. Musste viel lernen. Musste is in the simple past, and so it means the same thing. He had to study a lot. He had to study a lot. So musste viel lernen is a lot easier because it's the exact same sentence structure as if it were in the present tense. The present tense would be muss viel lernen. He has to, he must study a lot. So all we did was we took müssen, muss, musste. We put that in the simple past. So that is a lot simpler with the simple past, right? But it's important to be able to recognize this perfect form as well. Okay, so we'll compare. He had to study a lot, both of these. Hat viel lernen müssen is the perfect with a modal verb. Hat viel lernen müssen. But the simple past with a modal verb, this is the same thing, just showing you them next to each other. Musste viel lernen. He had to study a lot, but this is also he had to study a lot. But in this version, we've got the double infinitive at the end. And in this version, we just have normal verb in the second position, modal verb in the second position, and then the other infinitive at the end. Same structure as if it were present tense. Okay, so the perfect version is, this past tense, perfect version is hat, and then whatever else you need, finish the sentence. And then at the end of the sentence, you have your infinitive plus the modal verb infinitive. So main verb infinitive, modal verb infinitive. That's how the perfect goes with a modal verb. But then the simple past version with the modal verb is modal in the simple past, like musste, and then the infinitive, whatever the main verb is. So those are, they both express the same thing, but very different verb structures. So we have a slightly more complex sentence, but it's the same principle. We're going to say, the party did not want to recommend a candidate. So let's try the perfect with the modal verb. Die Partei hat keinen Kandidaten empfehlen wollen. So the party, and then hat wollen together makes the past tense happen, right? So, and then it's no candidate, so not, there's also a not in there. The party did not want to recommend a candidate. So the simple past with the modal verb, we're going to say the same sentence, but with the simple past instead, and it'll be, die Partei wollte keinen Kandidaten empfehlen. So here we've just got our modal verb in the simple past, and then we've got our infinitive at the end. Like you would, same way as you had in the, if you were in the present tense, you would say, die Partei will keinen Kandidaten empfehlen. The only difference would be will instead of wollte, just that verb conjugation, present versus simple past. But as soon as we're going to do the perfect, this changes to hat, and then we got the double infinitive. It's very different. So the perfect version is hat plus main verb infinitive plus modal verb infinitive. And then the simple past version is modal and simple past plus infinitive. So compare, we're going to now take that same sentence we were just doing, but make it into a dependent clause. And you know the thing about dependent clauses is that they're verb kickers. So the verb needs to be kicked to the end, but we already have two verbs at the end. So we need to think about, well, now we have three verbs at the end, and we need to learn the order that those go in. So perfect with a modal verb in a dependent clause goes da, since is da, that's going to be our subordinating conjunction, since the party did not want to recommend a candidate. So the fact that da is now there means that we can't have our verb in the second position anymore. We need to have our verb at the end. But the question is, how far do we kick it? So it is since the party, and then no candidate wanted to recommend, right? So normally the verb would come in the second position here. Die Partei hat keinen Kandidaten empfehlen wollen, like this. Die Partei hat keinen Kandidaten empfehlen wollen. And so what we need to do is move this hat and we kick it to the end. And you would imagine, usually when we do a verb kicking, we kick it all the way to the end. That's the standard rule. So you would think that we would kick hat all the way to the end, but it's a strange situation and that doesn't happen. So hat actually just gets kicked this far to right before the double infinitive. The double infinitive really wants to be last. So the conjugated hat right here, the conjugated version of the helping verb, it gets kicked only as far as right before the double infinitive. That's how we get da die Partei keinen Kandidaten hat empfehlen wollen. Yeah. So let's try with just the simple past instead of trying to do the perfect. When we do the simple past, we don't have to worry about that hat anymore. It's not there. It's just the simple past of the modal verb. So we would say, da die Partei keinen Kandidaten empfehlen wollte. It's simpler because we only have two verbs to deal with, and compare the version that's not a dependent clause, it's just the main clause. Die Partei wollte keinen Kandidaten empfehlen. So we're going into a dependent clause, so of course we're going to kick the verb to the end. So in this case, the general rule is you kick the verb all the way to the end. And in this case, it's going to actually happen that way, like you would expect. So the party, and then wanted to is being kicked to the end. So we end up with da die Partei keinen Kandidaten empfehlen wollte. So normally the wollte was here before, after die Partei, and we've taken it and kicked it all the way to the end. So that's how you do it with the simple past and the modal verb. So the perfect version with the dependent clause is hat plus all at the end of the sentence piled up these three verbs, hat plus the main infinitive plus the modal verb infinitive. But then the simple past version is the main infinitive and then the modal in the simple past, wollte, conjugated in the simple past. Okay, when a double infinitive occurs at the end of a dependent clause, like we were just looking at, review dependent clauses in Kapitel 14.2, the double infinitive remains in the final position with the auxiliary verb in the position preceding it. So that's what I was just saying, where the helping verb, auxiliary verb, doesn't get kicked all the way to the end, but only to just before the double infinitive. So the double infinitive remains in the final position and the auxiliary verb in the position preceding it, creating what appears to the untrained eye to be a pileup of verbs. And here's that sentence we were working with just now. Da die Partei keinen Kandidaten hat empfehlen wollen, since the party did not want to recommend a candidate, wussten die Wähler nicht, was sie am Wahltag hätten machen sollen. This is probably the most complicated thing you can do with a verb. So the voters didn't know, wussten die Wähler nicht, the voters didn't know, and then this is another dependent clause, was sie am Wahltag hätten machen sollen, what they were supposed to do on election day. So they were supposed to do is like 4 verbs, I guess it's 3 verbs because to do is 1 verb. And in English we have 3 verbs next to each other. So were supposed to do. And to someone learning English, 3 verbs next to each other like this is pretty confusing, right? Just like hätten machen sollen is pretty confusing to someone first learning German. Were supposed to do is also pretty confusing. The one added element here is that hätten is actually in the subjunctive, which comes later. So don't worry about this one too much yet, because we're going into the subjunctive in more detail later. So it's similar because it's a version of, see how hat and hätte, basically hätten is the subjunctive. It's the same as conditional hypothetical. So it's a slightly different version of hat, hätte, but the principle, the word order principle is still there. So we still have our version of haben, conjugated, and then our double infinitive. The main infinitive, to do, and then the modal verb infinitive last. Der Lehrer wusste sofort, dass der Schüler den Aufsatz von einem anderen Schüler hat schreiben lassen. Now we're combining several things we've just learned. Hat schreiben lassen is 3 verbs at the end. And so I have another slide that will break this up a little more because it's pretty complicated. So here we have that same sentence. Der Lehrer wusste sofort, dass der Schüler den Aufsatz von einem anderen Schüler hat schreiben lassen. So the teacher knew immediately, this is simple past, he knew, dass der Schüler den Aufsatz, that the pupil, meaning K through 12 student, that the pupil had the essay written by another student. So we learned that lassen is actually what you use when you get your hair cut, or when you get yourself divorced, or when you have someone fetch something for you, you have someone do something for you, that's actually lassen. So they translated it as the pupil had arranged to have his essay written. Look at this, had arranged to have written, had arranged, have written, that's 4 verbs. So I think that's even, the reason that's more verbs is because they put in this arranged because it sort of conveys that idea of lassen, to have someone do something for you. But you could also just translate this a little simpler with you have something done for you, but in the past tense, so you end up with had. The teacher knew immediately that the pupil had the essay written by another pupil. So this first had is for the past tense, and the second had is the idea of arranging for someone else to do something for you, right? So that second had is lassen, right? And then that first had is indicating past tense. Okay, so that's what we have, but let's take it back to a simpler version to see what's going on. So let's transform this dependent clause, starting with das, it's a dependent clause, right? Let's transform that and it's in the perfect, it's in the past tense. Let's make it into the simplest version we can, which is a main clause in the present to see what has happened. Der Schüler lässt den Aufsatz von einem anderen Schüler schreiben, which means in the present tense, the pupil has the essay written by another pupil. So in this case, you can see that lässt, which is present tense of lassen, actually indicates has in the sense of arranging. The student arranges for the essay to be written by another student. So that's lässt. And then we just combine lassen with the infinitive to make this construction in English to have it done for you. Have it written, have it done. So that's what we would have is lassen plus schreiben means have it written, have it done. So now let's do this same sentence, but we're going to put it in the past, in the perfect, but it's still going to be a main clause. We're not going to go to the dependent clause again yet. So to make the perfect where we already have these two verbs here, so we already have lassen and schreiben that we're dealing with, right? And so when we want to make the perfect happen, but we have two verbs already, you end up dealing with hat, your helping verb, and then you just, instead of making a past participle like you normally would, like geschrieben or something, you end up just having the double infinitive at the end. So, der Schüler hat den Aufsatz von einem anderen Schüler schreiben lassen, which is just hat plus these two infinitives just indicates the past tense now. So instead of saying he has the essay written in the present tense, we're going to say he had the essay written in the past tense. So that's how you do that. Hat schreiben lassen, past tense. And now that we want to go back to the dependent clause, we're going to take this whole thing and make it a dependent clause instead. All we need to do is think about the verb kicking at that point. And the verb kicking is going to happen where you take this hat, and you're not going to kick it all the way to the end, but only almost to the end right before that double infinitive. And that's how we get to this sentence at the very top. Dass der Schüler den Aufsatz von einem anderen hat schreiben lassen. So hat gets kicked to right here, and then you get hat schreiben lassen. Yeah, okay. So all modals in the perfect tense occur with the auxiliary verb haben. So remember how in the perfect and the perfect, sometimes you say sein and sometimes you say haben, like ich bin gegangen, I went, I am gone, versus ich habe gekocht, I have cooked, right? So you had to learn that when you did the perfect. But if you're going to use a modal, if there's any modal involved at all, then it defaults to haben. So even if the verb would have used sein, to be, as its auxiliary helping verb, it doesn't matter anymore because the modal verb is now making it haben instead. Yeah. So when you come upon a verb form of haben, check the end of the clause and pick up the double infinitive or regular form of the past participle, and in order to translate the entire verb unit. So you have to find all the verbs and see how they work together in order to make your verb unit in English, because in English the verbs are usually going to be all together instead of split up like we've been seeing. When you encounter a double infinitive following haben at the end of the clause, remember that the infinitive of the modal actually represents a past participle. Yeah, so that's this, where we had so normally you would have your version of hat plus a past participle to make the perfect. But here we don't have a past participle, we just got two infinitives. And so these two sort of replace the participle that would have been there. So they actually represent a past participle. Okay. And then, yes, that was that. And then here's another way to use double infinitives that has a different meaning. It's sort of a different way to use it, but they look similar, but the meaning is a little different. So, hören, to hear, sehen, to see, and lassen, to let, can function similarly to modal auxiliaries, meaning you get the double infinitive at the end. So like the modals, these verbs require double infinitive construction when forming the present perfect or the future, two tenses we were just talking about, when there's the dependent infinitive involved. So after verbs of this type, English often uses a present participle, but German uses a dependent infinitive. So, habt ihr das Flugzeug kommen hören? So that would be, did you hear the plane coming? In English, we could actually do this two ways. You could say, did you hear the plane coming? Or you could also say, did you hear the plane come? So in that case, it looks more parallel. Like, did you hear the plane come? And it's just the infinitive, and it sounds closer because coming is like a present participle, but here it's not a present participle, it's just the infinitive. So did you hear the plane come, or did you hear the plane coming? Either way. But it's just, you just have to memorize that it's like the conjugated haben, and then the double infinitive at the end. And then the last one is going to be like that perception verb. So seeing or hearing. Did you hear it coming? Did you see it coming? Then the last one is going to be like what you're asking the person. And then the second to last will be like the other thing they are supposed to observe, right? So, habt ihr das Flugzeug kommen hören? Did you hear the plane coming, or did you hear the plane come? Wir haben das Flugzeug abstürzen sehen. We saw the plane crashing. So, just like the other ones, it sort of doesn't look like a past tense, right? We haben, and you would expect to make a past tense with like gesehen. Wir haben gesehen, we saw, right? Normally you need wir haben gesehen to make we saw in the perfect. But since we've got another infinitive, another verb happening, the double infinitive sort of blocks that past participle from happening. So the double infinitive implies that this one, last one, is actually a past participle. Yeah. So abstürzen is crash. So you could say we saw the plane crashing, or you could say we saw the plane crash. Either way, yeah. Sie haben den Verletzten auf der Straße liegen lassen. So liegen lassen is just to, they often go together and just means to leave it lying there. So they left the injured man lying in the street. So liegen is of course lying, and then lassen would be left behind, left. Yeah. So haben plus double infinitive, lying, left. They left him lying there. Yeah. And then the future, also with a dependent infinitive, also results in a double infinitive at the end of the clause. So let's just look at these examples. Wir haben das Flugzeug kommen hören. That's just like the other ones we were just looking at. We heard the airplane come or coming. And then with the future tense, it's different verb tense, but the structure is going to be basically the same, except for instead of haben, we're going to do werden. We will hear the plane coming, or we will hear the plane come. Yeah, so instead of we have heard it coming, or just we heard it coming, it's we will hear the plane coming. Okay, so then of course lassen is quite a tricky verb, and we talked about it already in Kapitel 15 a little bit. And so we're just building on that with the lesson, right? So it can mean let, allow, leave, cause, or arrange for something. So when we have the other infinitive added to lassen, we have the double infinitive. So we can say, leider hat den Computer bei schlechtem Wetter draußen liegen lassen. So he left it lying there. That's just like the one we were just doing. And then, und muss ihn daher reparieren lassen. So he left it lying outside in bad weather, and therefore he has to get it repaired. So you'll see that lassen is actually doing two different things here, and it needs to be translated two different ways. So this first one is like these, left it lying there. So it's like lassen means left, like left behind, and then the other infinitive just means left it lying there. It's that kind of double infinitive happening. And so it's like left lying, left behind. But then this other lassen means arrange for something to, so he's having it repaired, arranging for it to get repaired. So this first one is to let or to leave, and then the second one is to have it done or arrange for it to be done. So they both have double infinitives, but just based on the context, they will be doing different things and maybe need different translations. Yeah. So, direkt nach dem Krieg hat sich die Stadt ein Krankenhaus bauen lassen. So that's just like the reparieren lassen. Bauen lassen, had the hospital built. Directly after the war, the town had a hospital built. So they arranged for the hospital to be built, bauen lassen. Und nächstes Jahr wird sie eine Schule entwerfen lassen. And next year it'll have a school design. So that's also the same, like arranged for. But you can see that we still have that double infinitive happening. And in all those cases, we have the main verb infinitive plus the lesson. And then in the normal verb position is a helping verb. That's a modal verb. And in this one, we have the hat making it a perfect past tense situation. Yeah. Okay. So we will do some exercises, just a few sentences for you to practice some of those verb situations we just had. And then this will be the just 17.1, and then in the next unit we will move on with the next part of chapter 17. So viel Glück und wir sehen uns im nächsten Video. Tschüss, auf Wiedersehen.